During this course, I've been using my favorite pencil brushes, which are my Feels Like Pencil for Procreate brushes. You can test them out by using the sample set you got with the course. But you can also use any other pencil brushes you have. In this video, I'll share with you my brush strategy when I'm drawing. I'll show you how I organize and use my brushes, and the importance of that. And the first thing I do when I get a new brush set. And just as with all the videos in this course, during this video I'll be using my own brushes. But these tips will apply to any brushes you have. I feel like it's important to have lots of variety in the marks you can make with your digital brushes. So I make sure to spend a lot of time swatching real-life art supplies to create the most realistic looking set of brushes I possibly can. One of the first things you learn when you start drawing is the purpose of different types of pencils and materials. Some of them are great for sketching, others for dark shadows or details. You can even get one material that allows you to have a wide variety of marks. This can be a bit challenging when you transfer to digital brushes, because these brushes usually come with a set texture and shape. So it's important when you get a new brush set that you sample every brush. Once you know how each brush looks, you can organize them in categories. I always do this to my brush sets. I feel like it can be a bit overwhelming when you have so many brushes and you need to remember the name of that one particular brush you loved. So, what I like doing is separating them in categories. All the brushes in one category have similar or even the same purpose. But each of them will allow me to make different marks, giving me variety and freedom to explore the textures that work best for the reference I want to draw. So for example, on my Feels Like Pencil for Procreate brushes, I divided the categories with a little emoji at the right of the name card. You can see that in this brush set I have 9 different pencils instead of just one. I organized them by putting my favorite brush to start with at the top, and from there, go from sharpest pencil to thickest pencil. This way, I know that if I want a sharp brush, I should select one of the ones that are on the top. And if I want a thicker brush, I should select one of the pencils that are at the bottom of that category. There are also other categories like 2 detail brushes, 5 filler brushes that help quickly add values and shadows to your drawings, 4 texture brushes that allow you to add interest and textures, 1 knitter eraser, and 2 smudge brushes. I organize them like this because I like to start my sketch with a loose pencil brush, then slowly add more and more detail. After that, I like to fill in larger areas with quick values. Once I have everything, I like to finish my illustrations by adding textures. I won't use the exact same brush for every drawing, but I will use all the categories. I just like changing up the brushes I use to keep things fresh. So you get a wide variety of marks and they all feel like real pencil. I recommend you try all the brushes in your favorite brush set and organize them in a way that works for you. This way, when you're drawing, you don't have to think about that one particular brush you like. You can look at a brush within the category you need and save time. I'll show you what I mean. Let's say I wanted to start a new drawing. I will usually choose my gesture pencil for this, because it really feels like a soft pencil and it's awesome to make light and quick marks. Since this is such a comfortable brush to sketch with, I will usually work on my initial sketch using only this brush. But once I have that initial sketch, I'll change for a brush that is a bit sharper. This will help me clean up my sketch and start to slowly add details. For this, I'll use any of the brushes on the top part of this category. It depends on what I want and what I need to draw my reference. If I want clean and sharp lines, I'll go with the raw pencil or the HB pencil. But if I want something darker or bolder, I go with the 4B, 6B or even 9B pencil. It depends on the reference. For example, in this particular drawing, I chose the HB pencil to add more details to my sketch. With it and the knitter eraser as my eraser brush, I define the details of the face a bit more. I love this eraser because it can give you a wide variety of strokes depending on the pressure and the size you use. Using this combo, I'll continue to add more details to the sketch. Once I'm happy with my sketch, I like to move to a fill brush to add the base color underneath it. In this case, I chose the Yummy Pencil Fill from the Fill Brush category. And with this brush, I'm able to add a base color to my sketch very quickly. I can use any of the brushes in this category to add the initial values. With these brushes, I'm not thinking about detail. I'm thinking about filling a big area with a value quickly. With the main values in place, I can move on to a pencil brush that will help me get the texture of the fur. For this, I use the Willow texture brush. This brush is awesome for working on hair, fur, or even grass. I chose this brush next for this particular artwork because my subject is fluffy, but I probably would have chosen a different one if my reference would have been different. As I said before, you need to try your brushes and organize them so you know quickly which brush to use next when you're drawing. It's better to test your brushes outside of the context of your drawing, so you already know what each of these brushes can do before you start to draw. This way, you don't waste any time testing each brush for each drawing, but you already have them organized in a way that allows you to quickly choose different brushes for different parts of your illustration. I know at this point I want to start adding more details to my illustration. I just don't want to start immediately with the most detailed brush. So I choose one of the sharper pencil brushes on the top of the pencil category. In this case, I chose the raw pencil to start cleaning up the details and adding more details to the face. If I want to add again bigger shadows, I can go again with one of the filler brushes. And I will continue to use this formula of a sharper brush to add detail and a fill brush to make sure that the values are right. Once I'm happy with the values and how everything is looking, I'll choose a detail brush, such as the 0.3 mechanical pencil, to add those smaller details. The most important thing is that you sample your brushes. Personally, I like to keep a pack with under 30 brushes or so. I feel like a powerful pack is one that has lots of variety of marks with a lower number of brushes. This way, you can really get to know your materials, and it's not hard to remember what every brush in the pack can do, especially if you organize them in a way that aligns with your process. For instance, I usually use the Willow texture pencil for things like fur, hair, or grass, but I know that the soft grainy texture brush also has an interesting texture for these things, so I choose this one from time to time to draw grass, for example. I also know that I like to finish my illustration using textures, so I organize this pack by putting these textures I like to finish with at the bottom. I have 4 very different textures that help me make my illustrations look as if they were made with real pencil. So I like to go in with the dirty crosshatch brush, for example, and add this texture to the background. You can also use these texture brushes to help you add the texture to your subjects. For example, in this case I used the graphite dust brush to add that texture that the fruits have. This brush can also help me make freckles, for instance. So to reiterate, the most important thing you can do when you get a new brush set is testing each brush and thinking what this brush can help you with. Then, organize them by categories. If the pack you're using is already organized by categories, like the Feels Like Pencil for Procreate brush pack, make sure that the order that these categories are in works for you and your drawing process. The best thing you can do is organize those categories by following the process you have when you draw. Remember that the power of a pack is not in the number of brushes. A crazy high number of brushes may seem appealing, but it can actually be very overwhelming when you're just starting out. Because you get so many choices, you can get a bit of decision paralysis. The best thing for me is to have a smaller set of great brushes, between 20 and 30, that give you enough variety of markings to draw anything you want, from the sketch to the details and the finishing touches. Again, with this number of brushes, it'll be easier for you to remember more or less what each brush can do, and you'll be able to unlock the full potential of your drawing material. So if your favorite pack is one with a huge number of brushes, I would recommend you select a few of those and make a smaller pack with all your favorite brushes in it. This will for sure help you speed up your drawing process. After some time of using this brush set consistently, you'll be able to really get to know every brush in there and recognize all the different things you can do with just one of them. And you will be able to unlock the full potential of your digital brushes.